In this video, let's see how to create such large-scale oceans in Blender. For most of my ocean animations, I used a technique by Dylan Neill, and I'll post the link to his video in the description. Please take a look at it as well. I'm using Blender 3.3 as I found that the shader editor of Blender 3.5, the zoom in and zoom out capabilities, it's a bit slow. The technique should usually work. Let's take the default cube and under modifiers, let's add under physics, ocean modifier. And here are all the parameters for the ocean modifier. So let's use two different ocean simulations. The first one is going to be ocean swell. So this is going to be the large swell of the ocean. And the other one, let me press Shift D and duplicate it. And this is going to be the detail of the ocean. This is going to be the smaller waves of the ocean on the ocean swell. And we are going to layer one on top of the other. Let's organize this a bit and let's select ocean detail and ocean swell and then move to a new collection called ocean bakes and then press enter. For now, let's work with the ocean swell. And let's open another area and then change it to timeline. Here are all the parameters in the ocean modifier. When we hover our mouse on each of these parameters, the pop-up menu is displayed that explains what each of the parameter does. Please go through these parameters to understand the ocean modifier a little better. So in my example, I'm going to use a viewport resolution of 16 and a render resolution of 32. I'm going to use a spatial size of 300 meters, and this is in Blender units. And for the waves, we need to understand the scale of the waves. For that, let's add a cube and then change the dimensions of the cube to match something like a boat reference. There we go, something like that. So that we can understand how the scale impacts the ocean surface with respect to this boat reference. Let's rename this. I just double-clicked the left mouse button to rename it, and then let's rename it as boat reference. Perfect. Let's get back to the ocean. And for the waves, let's put the scale as 1. You can see that as we are changing the scale, the ocean gets more stormy. So for our ocean, which is relatively calm, let's use a scale of 1. And for the smallest wave, let's use 0.2. And for the choppiness, let's use 0.7. And for the wind velocity, let's use 8 meters per second. And you can also see the difference. More the wind, the smoother the wave. And for the alignment, let's use 0.5. So this is the alignment of the swell. And for the direction, I'm just going to give it a random direction of 20 degrees. And then for the damping, let's reduce the damping a little bit to 0.4. So all of these parameters are explained in the pop-up right here. So please take a look at them and then play around with these parameters to get the ocean look that you are interested in. So this is for the ocean swell. We need to animate the ocean to see how the simulation runs. So for that, we need to keyframe the time. So let's go to frame 0 and then keyframe a time value of 0. And then since this is ocean swell and we are using 24 frames per second, let's get to frame 48, which is going to be 2 seconds of animation. And here, let's give the time as 1 and then insert a keyframe by pressing I. And let's see. There we go. That's a nice swell. But as we can see, after frame 48, the animation stops. Let's right-click on the time parameter here and then extrapolation mode. Let's use linear extrapolation. Now the ocean animation continues. In order to see what the linear extrapolation did, let's go to the graph editor, and then we can see what the linear extrapolation did. So the linear extrapolation extended the animation in a linear fashion beyond frame 48 to infinity. So this looks good. Let's bake the ocean swell. So for that, let's give it a cache path. And let's choose, I have an NVMe drive, a solid state drive, and a hard drive. So for this, I'm going to use a solid state drive. And I'm going to name the folder as Ocean Tutorial. And Ocean Tutorial. Let's add another folder by right-clicking. And we will name this as Ocean Swell Bake. And then since we also know that we're going to use an ocean detail bake, let's also create that folder right now, Ocean Detail Bake. We're going to select the Ocean Swell Bake for the cache path. There we go. Perfect. Now, in order for this, let's just have an animation for 150 frames, but you can go as high as your animation needs it. And then before we hit bake, let's save the file. Perfect. And let's click on bake. Now the ocean simulation is baking. And let's check the bake files. There we go. We have all the EXR files. Perfect. Now let's disable the ocean swell in the viewport. And let's enable the ocean detail. Now for the ocean detail, let's have a viewport resolution at 32 and render at 64. And then the spatial size, let's keep it at 100. And for the waves, let's have the scale at 0.3 and the smallest wave as 0. And the choppiness, we're going to have it at 1.4. And the wind velocity, let's reduce this to 3 meters per second. There we go. That's the ocean detail that we're looking for. And for the alignment, and the direction, let's put it in the same direction as the ocean swell. And for the damping, and at frame 0, and at frame 48, let's keyframe the time value of 1. So what we're going to do, let's use viewport render animation. Take a look. So under view, viewport render animation. Before we do that, let's just make sure that so this is typically how it looks. So we need to do a linear extrapolation because the animation stops after frame 48. So let's right click and then linear extrapolation. And there we go. So now the animation continues to infinity. So let's do the animation for, let's say, just 50 frames to begin with. View, viewport render animation. And in order to look at this animation, let's click on render and then click on view animation. And here we go. This is the ocean detail animation. So now that we have the ocean detail animation dialed in, let's get this back to 150. And let's work on the bake. And even here too, let's change it to 150 frames. And then for the cache path for the bake, let's select our folder that we created. And let's just save the file. And let's bake the ocean. The detailed bake is going to take a little while. Now the bakes are complete. Let's take a look at the bake folder. And there we go. So now that the ocean swell and ocean detail bakes are complete, let's disable both the ocean detail and ocean swell. And also let's exclude the ocean bakes from the view layer. Let's move on to the actual ocean part. In order to get the ocean, let's add circle. Let's keep the default 32 vertices and the radius, let's put it at 200 meters and the fill type as triangle fan. And there we go. And before we proceed further, let's head to the view tab of the end panel and then let's change the clip end to 10,000 meters. And let's do the same thing for the camera before we forget. Let's change the clip end to 10,000 meters so that nothing is clipped while viewing. Let's head to edit mode. Let's select the outer vertices by pressing Alt, left click on the outer vertices to select all of them. And then click E to extrude and S to scale, and then scale by 10. Let's add a few control loops. Let's add a few more. Let's add a few more as we get close to the boot reference. So let's press Alt and select the vertices close to the boot ref, and then press S to scale as close to the boot reference as possible. There we go. Now let's add a few control loops. There we go. So now we have sufficient geometry for this ocean plane to displace according to the ocean detail and ocean swell bakes. Perfect. Now for this, let's start by changing a few parameters. So let's go to the render properties and render engine. Let's select cycles, feature set. Let's get to experimental. And then device, I have a decent GPU, so I'm going to use a GPU. Let's go to sampling. And for the viewport, I'm just going to leave it as default, and denoise, I'm going to leave it at default. And for render, I'm going to keep it at 512. And then denoise, I'm going to use Open Image Denoise with albedo and normal passes. And here, if you see, there is this subdivision, which is enabled after we enable the experimental feature set. Into the subdivision, let's change the dicing rate render. This is the size of a micropolygon in pixels for the adaptive subdivision. So this ocean plane is going to be subdivided based on the distance from the camera. So that's how we get more detail near the camera and then less detail farther from the camera. So the smaller the dicing rate render, the higher the quality. So let's keep it at 2 pixels. And then for the viewport, I'm gonna have it at 8 pixels. And off-screen scale, I'm gonna have it at 8 pixels. And the max subdivisions, we can have anywhere between 12 and 16. And the dicing camera, we're gonna select the default camera that we already have for the dicing. The motion blur is enabled. And under simplify, we have the texture limit. And let's change the texture limit to 4K for the render. And then 512 for the viewport. Let's make this 1K for the viewport. So this is going to help us with the VRAM optimization if we have any textures. And under film, if we are using any HDRI backgrounds and we want them to render with the transparent background, we can click on the transparent background. But right now we're just going to use the default Nishita sky texture for the background, so we don't need this. Our performance, I typically go with the tile size of 512. That works on my GPU, and I have a Nvidia RTX 3070 laptop GPU. And persistent data, typically I keep this on, but if I am running low on VRAM or dedicated GPU memory, then I would uncheck it. For now, let's leave it on. I think we have everything we need. Let's get to output properties and the resolution. I'm just going to keep it at 50% for now. If you want full HD, then we can crank it all the way up to 100%. And the output folder. Let me create a folder. I'm going to use the file format as PNG. and image sequence is overwrite. And that's it for now. And let's get to the world properties. My startup file has a Nishita sky texture by default. So these are my parameters. And under modifier properties for the ocean plane, let's add a subdivision surface. This is to add a little more detail to the already existing geometry. And then let me add another subdivision surface. And for the second subdivision surface, I'm going to switch on the adaptive subdivision. And the final scale here, if you see the render is 2 pixels and viewport is 8 pixels, these are the same values that we provided here under subdivision. Now, let's go ahead and start texturing the ocean plane. Right now, if we go to the cycles preview, we're just going to have a regular plane. To this, let's select the ocean plane and add a new principled BSDF shader. I'm going to open a new workspace and then just type my shading. And in this one, I'm just going to open a shader editor and let me press 0 to get to the camera view. Under View tab in the End panel, let me click on Camera to View so that we can change the view of the camera. And let me just go back to the layout. In the camera, under Viewport Display, let me click on the Composition Guides. I'm going to select the thirds. This will help with better visualization. And also for the focal length, I'm going to use 26 millimeters. Well, let's get back to my shading workspace. I'm going to have 2/3 of the ocean and 1/3 of the sky. And let me select the ocean plane, and there we go. That's our principal BSDF. So to start, let's change the base color, bring it all the way down to dark. And then for the IOR, let's change the IOR to IOR of water, which is 1.33. And then for the specular, let's change this to specular nature of water, which is 0.25. And let's have the roughness all the way to 0. Perfect. Now let's see what we get. There we go. Let me change the sun direction. Perfect. Now let's start adding our nodes. Let's deselect the camera to view so that the camera will not change now. We also have a camera tab here if you would like to use. Actually, let's do that. Let's use this. And let's close this. Perfect. So now we have a nice view. Let's begin by adding an image texture. On this image texture, while the image texture is selected, let me press Ctrl T So that's going to add the mapping and texture coordinate node. This is because I have a Node Wrangler add-on enabled. Or if you go to Edit Preferences and under Add-ons, and here we go, Node Wrangler. Let me change the type to texture under mapping. Let me connect the object to the vector. And then for the object, let's create, let me head back to the Layout tab, and let's create an empty plane axis. And for this empty, let's change the size to something like 50 meters so we can actually see it. So I'm actually changing the size for the display. I'm not actually changing the default size of the empty. I'm only changing the display size. And let's rename this as texture placement. Right? And then for the circle, I'm just going to change this to ocean. In fact, let's rename it as large scale ocean. Perfect. And we don't need this light. Let me delete that. Let's get back to my shading. And let's select this ocean plane. And there we go. So for the texture coordinate, we'll select this texture placement as the object. And the reason we're doing this is because if we want to change the scale, we can actually scale the texture coordinate without changing any of the baked files. Now let's change the scale to our spatial size of ocean swell, because we're going to first start working with the swell, and the location to -half of this value in the X and Y. And let me just change this to ocean swell. Now here, we would like to get the displacement as well. So for that, let's search for vector displacement. Let's connect displacement to displacement and tangent space to world space. Perfect. Now let's duplicate this and let's change this to ocean detail. And then the actual scale is 100 for our ocean detail mesh. So the location is going to be -50. And the object is going to be the texture placement empty object. Perfect. Now let's mix these two by using mix RGB. And color to color. Color to color from the ocean detail. We need to do a little bit of color separation here. So let's add separate color. And then let's add combine color. Now let's connect the red to red, and let's connect the green to blue and the blue to green. And the reason we're doing this is because if you look at the EXR images, when we layer the ocean swell and ocean detail on top of each other, interchanging the green and blue channels is going to give a very nice depth to the ocean. And then this color, let's plug in to the vector. Perfect. Now let's refresh this. All right, so now we have our node setup. Now let's open the ocean swell. Let's give it. Let's get to the directory and let's press A. Now all the EXR images for the ocean swell bake are selected, and then press open image. And there we go. We have an entire image sequence open. And as we can see the ocean swell here. Let's also open the ocean detail. And let's press A again. And there we go. We have the entire ocean detail. If we look closely, this doesn't seem like displacement. And the reason for that is if we go into the material properties of the ocean plane, under settings, the surface displacement is set to bump only. We need to change this to displacement only. And there we go. Now the displacement is actually showing up on the surface. Perfect. Now let's pull a timeline. And let's try and animate the ocean. There doesn't seem to be any movement in the ocean. And the reason for that is in this image sequence, for every frame, the EXR file has to be refreshed. So let's click on the auto refresh, which does actually that for the swell and the detail. Now let's play. There we go. Perfect. So that's how we get the ocean animation. So we can run a sample animation by animating the camera. Before that, let's do a test render. So I'm going to go for 100% of 1080p resolution. And then I'm going to do a test render. Here we go. Let's just get the boat reference hidden from the viewport and render, and then do a test render again. Let's get to layout workspace and boat reference. Let's switch this off and then do a test render again. There we go. That's the beautiful ocean right there. Under my shading here. If you noticed, while I'm making this tutorial, I changed this from mix to linear light. Linear light actually gives more depth to the ocean surface. And that's the reason we're getting a more realistic ocean. And one more thing is regarding the persistent data. Here, if you notice, the persistent data has been switched off. And the reason for that is just like auto refresh here, if the persistent data is switched on, then for some reason, the adaptive subdivision calculations are not happening on every frame. So that's the reason I switched off the persistent data. And now the adaptive subdivision refreshes and the calculations happen for every frame. So please ensure that the persistent data is turned off. So we can run a sample animation by animating the camera. Let's change the direction of the camera. Let's change the Y to 0 and then Z to 0. . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . There we go. Perfect. And let's insert a location and rotation keyframe here. And let's get to frame 100. And then let's give an X value of 82 degrees and insert a keyframe. There you go. Perfect. Now, from the initial location, the camera is going to move along the y-axis a couple of 100 meters. So let's get to the last frame, which is frame 100, GY, and then insert the location and rotation. That's going to be the ocean animation. I've changed a few parameters to have a better overall look. I changed the sun elevation from 15 degrees to 5 degrees and the sun rotation to 37.8. Let's render this animation. We have the output folder, which is Ocean PNG, and let's head to render, render animation. Now that the rendering is complete, let's import this image sequence into Davinci Resolve for the animation. Let's open a new project and let's name this Ocean Animation. And under settings, it's 24 frames per second at 1080p. And target loudness level, let's change to -14 and then save. Let's click on media. Let's drag our Ocean PNG image folder. Let's get to the cut page. And there we go. That's our beautiful ocean animation. Let's add some sound effects and some music. And for that, let's go to Epidemic Sound. I'm going to use this. And for sound effects, I'm going to search for waves, and I'm going to use the ocean waves. Let's head to the downloads folder. Let's get to the edit page. All right, let's get the ocean clip here. Let's get the music clip here. All right, and let's export. And then we'll add to render queue and then render it. And for my export settings, QuickTime as a format and H.264 codec with 1080p resolution at 24 FPS. And for the quality, I typically keep it at automatic and the best quality. And encoding profile, I'll leave it at auto. And keyframes, typically I either leave it at automatic or every 30 frames. And let's see.